In this video, we're going to talk about the female reproductive system. So the reproductive system, the role in the female is much, much more complex because of pregnancy. So the ovaries are going to be the female gonads, and the process that we're going to talk about here is what's called oogenesis. And oogenesis is the production eventually of the secondary oocyte. So oogenesis is simply a type of gametogenesis, just like we learned that spermatogenesis was also a type of gametogenesis. The ovary is also a mixed gland, just like the testes was, and it's mixed because it secretes a female gamete, which is the ova, or the secondary oocyte. It's also exocrine because it produces estrogen. These are a few forms of estrogen. Estradiol tends to be a very potent one, as well as progesterone. So we could see the ovary on this image here with the uterine tube and the uterus as well. The internal genitalia would be the ovaries and the duct system, which would be the uterine tube, uterus, and then finally the vagina. And the vagina is labeled right here. So the ovary is the gonad where the secondary oocyte is produced. During ovulation, it's then released into the peritoneal cavity. And the large majority of the time, the oocyte is going to travel into the uterine tube where fertilization is going to occur in what's called the ampulla of the uterine tube. So the duct system is a lot more, it's open instead versus the males, which is closed. So our next slide, we're going to look at the ovary. And the ovary has this outer cortex that houses those forming gametes and an inner medulla that contains the large blood vessels as well as nerves. So the two main structures we're going to see here is the developing oocyte plus the ovarian follicle. And the ovarian follicle is these tiny sac-like structures which are going to surround that developing oocyte, the immature egg. So the oocyte is the specific term for the egg, and it's surrounded by these follicle cells. So each month, a ripened follicle is going to eject that oocyte during what's called ovulation. So in this image, you have in your textbook, this is another one that I've added here, but the ovarian follicle is being shown at various stages here. And in the image to the right, we can see the stages a little more clearly. So initially, there is a primordial follicle. It becomes a primary follicle. It further develops to eventually a mature Graafian follicle. As it's developing, it becomes a secondary follicle. And inside, housed within those follicular cells, is this oocyte. And within the primordial follicle, the primary follicle, the secondary follicle, there is a primary oocyte, which is diploid. So remember, whenever you hear primary, whether it's going to be for the male or the female gamete, it's always going to be diploid. When you hear secondary, and again, this applies to both genders, you're going to remember that it has the haploid number, which means there's 23 chromosomes. The diploid 2N means there are 46 chromosomes. So within this mature Graafian follicle, which is also called the tertiary follicle, there is what's called the secondary ovum or the secondary oocyte. That now means that meiosis one has been completed, and we have a haploid amount of chromosomes that are present. So the follicle ruptures, thus releasing this liberated ovum. Afterwards, the follicle collapses and forms this structure called the corpus luteum. And the corpus luteum is a temporary structure that produces hormones, predominantly progesterone, but also some estrogen. And if pregnancy does not occur, it becomes scar tissue, which is called the corpus albicans. We'll be touching on this more later, but I wanted to point out in this image. Our next slide is showing the internal female reproductive organs, some of which we've already talked about. So the uterine tubes are also called the fallopian tubes or oviducts, but they receive the ovulated oocyte and are the usual site for fertilization. So the regions of the uterine tube are the infundibulum, and the infundibulum is closest to the ovary. It's a funnel-shaped structure that opens into the peritoneal cavity. In fact, the margins of the infundibulum are covered by these finger-like projections, which are called fimbriae. And the fimbriae help to move in a sweeping manner to ensure that the oocyte, once it's ovulated, is released into the uterine tube. The next part of the uterine tube is the ampulla, and this forms about half of the uterine tube length. And what's important about it is it's the site where fertilization occurs. And finally, the last part of the uterine tube is called the isthmus, and that is closest to the region of the uterus. So during ovulation, the uterine tube is going to capture that oocyte. There is a possibility that it goes into the peritoneal cavity, but hopefully that does not happen. So the fimbriae, they stiffen and they sweep the ovarian surface, creating this current to carry the oocyte into the tube. So during ovulation, it's important that you know that LH triggers ovulation. Also, after ovulation occurs, the structure that is present in the ovary, which we can see shown here as well as here, is the corpus luteum. And you should know that the corpus luteum produces progesterones and estrogen. The big one is the progesterone. So that happens after ovulation. Also, this fertilized egg, once it develops, which is what we're going to talk about in chapter 28, it eventually burrows into the endometrium lining of the uterus. You should know the three different layers of the uterus: endometrium, myometrium, and perimetrium. And the myometrium is the smooth muscle that's going to be responsive to oxytocin. So when they use the synthetic form of oxytocin to stimulate labor, they use what's called Pitocin.